Is cheating acceptable to win? And I think the reason why I asked that question is I think because we have placed sports as an idol. We have made it in the U.S., particularly when it comes to certain sports like football and baseball. I think we have seen it a whole lot throughout history. But is it acceptable?
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Hey folks, welcome to another solo edition of Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm Peter Demas. Today I want to talk about something that I don't really talk about very often, which is what's happening in sports, and really specifically what came out of the Auburn-Georgia football game that happened over this weekend. Now, a couple things in full disclosure is I am an Auburn football fan. I've been an Auburn fan since the early '80s. I've been my daughter attended Auburn, so need to start off with just saying that as a whole. But I have seen a trend, and this is kind of, I want to point to the bigger trend than just this game or other games with it, of what is happening in sports and in relation to what we should be doing as Christians in relation to sports. Because I think there is an idol that I recognize this weekend, and I've talked about it in other shows or other podcasts and maybe some articles or prayers that I've done. But I think this kind of helped reveal something to me that I wanted to share with the rest of you. Now, I'm not a sports expert, so if I happen to say something about particular rules that have taken place, recognize that there's a possibility that I may have messed that up. But the overall theme of what I'm going to talk about, I think, is very accurate, and it's something that I encourage each of you to look up and to understand a little bit more about it, even if you don't like it, even if you don't like football, for example. So let's just kind of talk about in general what had happened. In this past weekend, Auburn played Georgia. It's a rivalry. It's not as big as the Auburn-Alabama game, but it's still a pretty big game. In this particular situation, Auburn came out of the gate just strong. Georgia is by far the favored in it. Auburn came out of the gate strong. Their defense was strong. Their offense was playing on all cylinders. Like, everything just seemed to be kind of working. And right before the half, we see the quarterback dives over and pushes himself through the pile, and he's holding on to the football. And the football crosses the plane, which would be a touchdown. And right after it got pushed over the plane, the ball got knocked out. A Georgia player picked it up, ran it back in to the end zone on the other side. The call on the field was that it was a fumble. There was a very, very long delay while they were reviewing it to find it, and they later came back and said it was indeed a fumble. However, still photography afterward shows that it was not just a fumble, that where you could see the line, you could see him holding on to the ball. It clearly was a touchdown at that point in time, and there's been many commentary on whether it was. Now, the question was, it was really a fumble, why they didn't give Georgia the touchdown, and that's a whole nother area that has to happen. And so that was just kind of part of it. And then after that, there was just a series of extraordinarily bad calls. There was a calls concerning a targeting call. There was which may or may not have been, I'm not 100% certain on that. There was definitely a roughing the passer call that wasn't the case. There was a lot of calls like that all throughout. And the next 2 minutes of the first half, it was was just everything. They were constantly stopping the clock to watch the game and giving Georgia some extra timeouts with it from there. And then in the second half, it didn't change much after that point in time. There was, again, a lot of just crazy calls that went back, and they all seemed to have favored Georgia over Auburn. Now, again, I know I'm speaking from an Auburn fan, and you always, whenever you root for a team, the officials rarely go against you, and they are always for the other team. I recognize that. And I will also recognize that Auburn's team is a very undisciplined team when it comes to penalties. They do have a lot of penalties, and a lot of them are very well deserved. And it's something that I wish they had more discipline on it, but they don't. But the main call that I thought was interesting is there was also a point in time where you see Kirby Smart, the head coach of Georgia. The clock is running down; it's getting down to about a second to left, and you see him doing this number, which is clearly calling for a timeout as he's running down the sidelines, and you see him calling for a timeout. They call a timeout. He comes back later and says, no, it wasn't a timeout, that what he was doing was he was clapping. He later said that he was alerting that the defense for Auburn was clapping, and that was illegal. But basically, whatever his motivation was, he then, in illustrating it to the officials right afterward, you see him doing one of this, indicating that, again, he was clapping. So in both situations, you see me being kind of actually silent. This I'm actually doing hard, and this is very soft, and you can even tell the difference in the noise level of which it was doing. If Kirby Smart was really calling a clap, if he was really calling it a clapping, he would have clapped. We see him clap all the time. We all know how to clap. We'd never clap like this. That has been the universal signal of timeout since I was a little boy. That's what we always did. So I'm not 100% certain why he did it, but ultimately, at the end, he lied. The officials gave him didn't call a delayed game. Did not credit him with a timeout, and basically they ended up getting the 3rd and 9 play to continue the drive. And so, but it also reminded me of a few weeks prior that in the same thing, Oklahoma was playing Auburn at Auburn as well, and a player kind of pretended to walk off the field, was even limping a little bit like he was leaving to go to the sideline, and while he was, and then he just lined himself up right on the edge of the sideline. He then ran down to the end zone, got a pass completely wide open. No one saw him because they all assumed he was leaving. That play is illegal. And on top of that, the SEC officiating even came out and said that play was illegal and it should have been called. No word has come out on the clapping or the touchdown or many of the other terrible calls that took place in that game. Now, what I'm seeing is those are just a couple of examples, and there are countless examples that I'm sure we could pick up everywhere. Now, I don't know if the officials in that game are incompetent or corrupt. There are a lot of people out there claiming that it's corrupt. They're saying that they were paid off by the SEC so that Georgia could be favored. Even people who aren't Auburn fans are saying that. I won't go so far to say that. I think that's a stretch without any proof, but we do know that there has been history in the past of officials that have been pressured to go one direction or another for different reasons. The one I could think of that occurred sometime in the early 2000s was Tim Donaghy, the NBA referee that took bribes, most likely to shave points or do something like that. I don't know what the situation is here. I think at best we can say that the officials just did not do a good job. And I think we all can argue that there are points in time in our life where we all don't do good jobs. So again, I'm not going to blame the officials and bring up these nasty conspiracy theories. I'm not going to chase that rabbit, even though it might be kind of fun on some level. But in reality, is probably not the case. The question I really want to bring up is this: is cheating acceptable to win? And I think the reason why I asked that question is I think because we have placed in sports, we've placed sports as an idol. We have made it in the U.S., particularly when it comes to certain sports like football and baseball. I think we have seen it a whole lot throughout the history. But is it acceptable? I mean, the job of a sports team is to win. And a lot of times we see this and we laugh at it. I know I have in the past. And I think sometimes we don't recognize kind of what's happening because it's our own team until it happens against our team. And then we're like, hey, wait a second, that's wrong. Well, why is that wrong? And in the times past when it favored my team, it was okay. I know Auburn in the history of the past did a lot of recruiting scandals. They were not allowed to have any TV games and were not allowed to play in any of the bowl games. This was back, I think, sometime in the 80s when that happened. It might have been early 90s. I don't remember. But I mean, but it did happen. And I think, we see this because we put this pressure on winning at all cost. Coaches know that if they don't win, if they don't maintain, they're going to lose their job. Fans they can be kind of crazy at times on it. So that's the question. Is cheating acceptable to win? And is lying acceptable to win? Because in these situations, we see both. We see Coach Smart lying. We see the Oklahoma coach. Can't think of his name right now. I don't know if he cheated, but one of his players cheated, and he has been silent about it to see if that happened from there. So, that's part of the question that we have. Now, there is a difference, and I want to make it very clear. There's a difference between cheating and taking advantage of gaps in the rules, and that's kind of between you and the Holy Spirit on how you want to handle that. I think sometimes I think there are certain situations where it's okay because it's not acceptable, or it is acceptable. Take, for example, before the pass interference call was even made in football, it was very common for players to get hit, catch, held on to, etc., in order to do it. That was perfectly fine because they didn't know any different that was just part of the game and how it worked. The spitball was seen as something that was normal and acceptable in baseball. They passed rules prohibiting that in both situations. And then, we see, obviously people still attempt to try to do so. There's some things where you don't do it intentionally, and I think there's some level of that as well. But I do think that there are times where we have to kind of understand and look at, from the intention as a Christian, what are we to do with that? How are we supposed to handle it without giving in to the idol of winning and the idol of sports? Fans, on the other hand, we're seeing them as well acting completely inappropriately. We see them threatening violence. I've seen it in this particular situation where they said, "Oh, I hope something to threaten the officials for making bad calls." That's just not acceptable. I've even seen in two situations where I was coaching in a high school soccer team, and in both situations, a high school boys soccer team. These were teams that were like 4th, 5th, and 6th place in their division, so they weren't like strong teams that were playing each other. It was two Christian teams. One season, in the situation that I remember, my goalie was black, and I heard the other team yell racist remarks at him to the point where his parents got up out of the stage. This is not that long ago. This would have been about 2021 or 2022. The following season, there was a terrible penalty that was done by the other side. The referee gave him a red card, kicked them out. I don't know if it deserved a red. I think it probably was more of a yellow, but again, it was one of those situations. It could have gone either way. I'm not 100% certain. But the parents literally chased the referees out into the parking lot, or some parents chased the referees out in the parking lot. What was sad was it wasn't even the parent of the student that did it. They got kicked out. It was another parent that did so. Now, what do you think compels people? How do you think that looks upon Christianity as a whole when something like that happens? How do you think that happens from there? We ask if lying and cheating is good, and we see situations throughout history where Rahab lied in order to protect life. We see Bonhoeffer conspire to take the life of Hitler, and we see him as a Christian hero. There are certain situations where it is acceptable, where it is good, but I think again, part of it is we have to recognize there are certain ideas and certain principles, such as the value of life, that is much higher, and that we have to be able to lie to be able to do so. For example, if I'm in a large crowd of people and somebody walks in with a gun and asks, the people where I am, I really hope that you would lie for me and tell them you have no idea where I'm at. But we see this over and over again. And what's funny is we've kind of seen it in another area where many Christians are very outspoken and very vocal about it, and that's where we have given hormones to boys where they think they're girls to play in women's sports, and we have seen the massive advantage of boys that are playing women's sports. We see that with Leah Thomas, and the situation there. He was a below average to an average swimmer in men's. Now, again, I have to say, if anybody that can swim to any level and get up to play at a collegiate level is obviously tremendously better than me. But at the same time, they are not someone who. But again, there's certain levels there. But all of a sudden, he goes from that to tying for first place with Riley Gaines, but giving the trophy at the very end in order to where we see these advantages that are given. However, in those particular situations, Christians are speaking out because it deals with a different idol, the idol of sex, the idol of gender, and we're seeing us cave into that. We are seeing it, and we're couching it sometimes as cheating, but in reality is we're trying to point out cheating in order to point out the bigger issue, which is this idea of that men aren't really women. Yet at the same time of giving hormones, we've seen in situations in the past where parents have done so. In 2005, there was a Colleyville High School. 9 students were admitted using steroids. These are high school students that were admitting and using steroids. Now, one of the parents caught them and turned them in. I think that is outstanding, and that is amazing that a mother would do so. But we also see in 2013, ESPN reported that the clinic gave performance-enhancing drugs to multiple high school students. Now, the Texas in 2005 did enact a steroid, not a steroid ban, but a steroid testing. They eliminated it in 2015 because it just wasn't worth the cost involved in it. But nevertheless, so I don't think it's very far run, but I do think that parents do that, and we see this idolatry that is being pushed along the way. I mean, we even can look at the extreme example of Wanda Holloway, the Texas cheer mom, who had somebody killed for her daughter to ensure that her daughter made the cheer team, or can't remember the exact details on it, made the cheer team or moved higher up on the cheer team for it. Regardless, this is when we're willing to take lives, when we're willing to damage children, when we are willing to do all this other stuff in order to win, we are clearly making an idol. I started recognizing it a while back. Where my house used to be, I would drive by a park that had multiple baseball fields on it, and I would see on the way to church in the morning, the parking lot would be full with youth sports where they had all these travel tournaments, etc. And I recognize that this is so different than the time. I mean, even Eric Liddell with the movie Chariots of Fire where he refused to run in his event on a Sunday because of his religious beliefs, and was highly criticized. Was told that he was a traitor and that he was against the crown for doing so. Ended up winning several events in areas that he should not have won. That was definitely a God type of moment on it. But regardless, we don't see that anymore. We're seeing where parents are bypassing church. We're seeing that they are not doing that. It is more important for you to teach your kids about God than it is for you to teach your kids how to hit a curveball. It is tremendously more important to do so. We are seeing this, and I think it is a huge problem within our culture, where we are allowing it, where we're allowing God's word to be diminished by our actions in order to win. So what is our job? What should the coaches have done in this situation? What should Kirby Smart have done? What should the coach at Oklahoma have done? And what should fans do in these situations with it from there? Now, in some situations, we may just kind of continue to argue and be blind. I'll start with the fans. What should we do in that situation? Well, in those situations, we can still kind of argue it and say, well, here's the situation. I believe this. So, for example, I will argue that was a touchdown. There are certain people out there who would argue it's not a touchdown. I think the evidence indicated very strongly it was. But sometimes we like to ignore the evidence in support of our own team, our own family, our own cultural views. I think we've all been guilty of it. I'm not excluded from that mix. There are many times where I think that a lot of those calls are. A good friend of mine who is a Georgia fan, I won't say a good friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine who is a good Georgia fan, is a big Georgia fan, said that he said the officiating was just terrible. He didn't point to anything specific. He didn't do anything. And I can honestly say I could think about 6 or 7 really bad calls, and I'm probably wrong just because, again, I'm a fan. I'm probably wrong on a handful of them. On it, but I can pretty much guarantee that if I can think of off the top of my head 7 terrible calls in one football game, there's probably several in there that probably is right, that I'm right on. I think just the odds of that happening are there, and I think that again we could see that if it were in the other direction too. So as a Georgia fan, I think that you have an obligation and duty to say, yeah, the officiating was bad. You can even go so far to say, "Hey, I believe that there was a touchdown, and whatever your belief happens to be, that's perfectly fine. That's part of the reason why we have arguments. The reason why we have conversations is to develop truth and define the truth in certain situations. And sometimes it's okay to agree to disagree. That's perfectly fine to have that happen. But what do we do in relation to other situations? So you take the Oklahoma situation where even the officials came back later and said, yeah, that was a cheating play. The Oklahoma fans ought to be putting pressure on their coaches, ought to be putting pressure on their program for the coaches to do the right things. As Christians, what should we be doing as Christians in this situation? Should we just kind of keep a blind eye because our team won? Again, we lose when you're on the other side. So I lose credibility, and that's why I started out right from the very beginning. I lose credibility as an Auburn fan to say that these other teams that played against Auburn were wrong, that they engaged in behavior that was cheating or lying. I lose credibility on that. I can speak out on it all day long, but immediately everyone's like, well, that's because you're a fan. But in this particular situation with Oklahoma, what is your job as a fan of Oklahoma to be able to do if you saw that and witnessed it and you recognized it? You should, in my opinion, publicly state something about it. If you're going to publicly state things about Oklahoma, if you don't normally, then don't do it. But if you normally state things, then at that point in time, you need to get out and state and put pressure on your coach to say, hey, you need to say something and do something about it, which leads to the next thing. What should the coaches and the programs do? I don't think they ought to be fired over something like that, but I do think that there ought to be issued a public statement. The coach in the Oklahoma situation should have stood up after the officiating came back and said, you know what? Either A, I didn't see it. I didn't know it happened until the next day. I apologize if there's any cheating. I teach my kids the right way to do things, and for some reason they did not. Or even or maybe even penalize the player and say, look, we saw this happen on the film the next day, and the player has been disciplined on it. We keep all that internal, but I think there needs to be some acknowledgement that cheating is not something that you will allow, and it's not something. And again, I don't know if he encouraged it, taught it, or whatever, and I don't know any of that. But if it were, then he needs to get up and publicly apologize for it. Even if he didn't even know that the rules are there. There's a lot of rules, and I don't expect the coaches to know every single one of them either. In the situation in the Georgia game, Kirby Smart needs to issue a type of statement to indicate what really happened. And even if he indicated that it was a mistake, even if he indicated he was trying to alert the officials because of the clapping on the other side, and he was calling for them a timeout for them to call that would be one thing. But for him to lie later and say he wasn't using the timeout signal, that what he was doing was he was really clapping, that's a difference. And I think that's a huge difference that we have to look at and we have to understand. But regardless of whatever he was wanting to do, I think he needs to come out and state it. He doesn't need to come out and maintain and keep the lie going. Now, again, if he's not a Christian, that's kind of understandable, and that's acceptable. When you're not a Christian, you win at all costs. That's kind of what you end up having to do, and that's what we end up resorting to when we're not honoring God. Now, again, we don't all live perfect lives. That's why the Bible tells us all has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's why we need a Savior. That's why we need Jesus. But part of our obligation as Christians and part of our fruit comes from our repentance, from turning back, from allowing these type of things to happen. And I think when programs don't do so, then I think that there is. I think what we're doing is we're continuing to allow this idol to get stronger, and it pushes down because these kids see it. The kids see that doping made things better, so they wanted to do so. The parents of the kids push it. And so they may teach one thing on one hand, but when they do something on the other, what they're doing is they're engaging not only in hypocrisy and idolatry, but more importantly, I think what they are doing is they're teaching the kids what really is true, and it's not God's truth. I think it's just something that we have to be careful of, and I think it's something that we need to be mindful of when we see certain circumstances to come right out and say it. Now, if next week, if Auburn's coach is doing something that is wrong and I don't speak about it, it could be the fact that there's always the possibility I didn't see it or didn't watch the game or whatever it happens to be. But if it ties in with something that I am talking about, you better believe I'm going to be talking about it. I'm not going to point out every single thing that I see that I think that people get away with. That's a fallacy of silence. I'm not asking for everybody to come right out and say something about it. But in this particular situation, there's enough about it in social media. There's been enough comments both at the professional and social media level, that I think that anybody that is commenting that does not mention this, I think is something that really need to check yourselves on it. I think we have to start speaking out. We need to start speaking to our team, and we don't always have to do it publicly. We can also just write the team itself. We can write the school itself and say, you need to give them a public apology in this situation. You need to stand up for what it is. Pull for your team to do the right thing. You don't have to come on to social media to do it. You can literally just notify the team that this is what we need to do. And I think it's important that we recognize that we have a duty as Christians that go beyond just our individual lives and our individual our benefits. we have a duty that serves a much greater God. And I think part of us doing so is being able to stand up for what is right, regardless of whether or not we received a benefit for it, or whether we achieved something, even vicariously through other people, that we need to do so. I think it is important that we do so as symbols and examples for our children, so that we can show that the Word of God is more than just words in our mouth, that there's power in there, and the part of that power deals with how we act and what we do when we are faced with certain situations. So thank you so much for listening to this. If you want to hear more content like this, please let me know. If you want to tell me how wrong I am in this situation, feel free to comment below. I'm perfectly fine acknowledging that there may be some nuances I'm not aware of in these certain circumstances. But at the end, we worship God, and we worship Him first and foremost, and ultimately that is who we serve, and we need to always remember that in all things that we do. Thank you so much, and God bless you.